All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Partisans Week continues. Nicole Hemmer has published a new book. It's called Partisans, and all this week she is bringing us stories from that book. Kelly and I don't know what they are going in, but we will try and say smart things, but mostly Nikki's going to say the smart things because she's the expert here. But hello, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt, author of the book Partisans. Hi.
Hello, Jody.
Do you have a subtitle? Does it have one of those like 15
I do,
word subtitles?
yes. It does have one of the very lengthy ones. It's called Partisans, the Conservative Revolutionaries Who Remade American Politics in the 1990s. It's easily at least 10 words.
Yeah, well, we like long titles here on this show, obviously. And Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hey there. Can I just say I absolutely love the cover art for this book. Mm-hmm. It is so powerful. It looks like a rally with the flag behind it. It's very vintage. It's just it's great. It's really, really great. Very eye-catching.
Thank you very much. It really evokes a fascism aesthetic. You have Pat Buchanan doing his best Benito Mussolini. Yeah. Not an accident, Kelly.
When you write a book, do you get a say in the cover?
My say was, look at the new cover. It's great, right? That was about it. We changed the size of the S at the end of 1990s, and that was as much of a hand as I had in it.
Right. Gotcha. Huh. All right. Well, they did a good job.
They did a great job.
All right. So, story number 2. First one was about black helicopters in Ruby Ridge. You can go listen to that. Number 2 from the early 1990s is?
Number 2 takes place on May 12th, 1992, and it involves the aforementioned Pat Buchanan. That is the day that Pat Buchanan arrived at Smuggler's Gulch, which is this steep canyon in the land between the U.S.-Mexico border near San Diego. And in the early 1990s, it had become a primary passage for migrants who were passing in and out of the U.S. without authorization. And I want to paint a picture for you of what was happening this day in May in 1992. Sunny day, late spring, early start of summer. You have all of these people gathering in Smuggler's Gulch. You have Mexican migrants who are kind of watching what's happening. They're selling sodas to campaign aides for Buchanan at a pop-up refreshment stand. You have members of the press who are gathered there for the press conference that Buchanan has called. Buchanan himself walks up. He's a little dusty from being in an all-terrain vehicle with a border patrol agent. They've been zipping along the Mexican border throughout the afternoon. And then you have another group of people who are represented by Tom Metzger. Tom Metzger was a member of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and the founder of the White Aryan Resistance. He had just recently gotten out of jail for burning a cross in Los Angeles. God. And perhaps most importantly, the reason that he was there was because in 1979, he founded the Klan Border Watch in California.
Oh, my God.
So it's this interesting moment where this confluence of forces are coming to the border. And I have to emphasize that in 1992, nobody was really talking about the border.
Yeah.
It wasn't a political issue of any measure. If you went to California in 1992 and you polled people, which they did, only like 2 to 3% of Californians said immigration was their topmost concern. It just wasn't the thing that they were thinking about. But Pat Buchanan was determined to make this an issue in the 1992 campaign. In fact, he had just begun calling for the Buchanan Fence, which was a wall on the border between the U.S. and Mexico.
Gosh.
Any resonances?
Yes. So can I ask you a question about the larger political climate? And then I think, the sort of border groups and the skirmishes and the vigilantes is super fascinating too. But, I'm just realizing, I think, that I don't really have a sense of like, this was an election year, obviously 92, as you mentioned, but, I don't really have a sense of George H.W. Bush's immigration policy or how he talked about the border or whether it really was an issue. I mean, I know Clinton, NAFTA, I think, put this in a little sharper under the spotlight a little bit. So I have a sense of when he becomes president, kind of why people start to pay attention to the border, particularly in an economic lens. But like you mentioned, it wasn't a thing. I mean, what was Bush's stance towards the border, or was it just like not on the list?
Well, so NAFTA is really interesting because Clinton is the person who signs NAFTA into law, but it was actually negotiated under George H.W. Bush. So Bush was a NAFTA guy. NAFTA called for easier immigration between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada and more open trade agreements. And Bush had been vice president under Ronald Reagan, who in 1986 had passed the immigration reform law that granted amnesty to people who had been in the country without documentation. It also tightened up some of the rules around immigration and introduced some new measures for border security. But this was a Republican Party that by and large was pro-immigration. It was during this period that the Wall Street Journal, for instance, ran an editorial that said that we should pass a constitutional amendment that declared open borders.
Wow.
Yeah, it was extremely pro-immigrant and extremely pro-immigration.
This is what I love about history is that we, it's not, some of it is amnesia, but we forget so much of what has been covered, what has been talked about. Like other generations don't pass that stuff down all the time, and so within one generation, not even that, within 5 to 10 years, we forget all of these things that have transpired or happened. And it really builds this like framework, this scaffolding for understanding what the GOP looks like, what the conservative right wing looks like. And it shows you that like these things are not static. They morph and they evolve and they like sort of, I don't know.
And they're crafted, right?
They're crafted. They're completely constructed, completely. And so all of this is just sort of mind-boggling to me, especially that he could be, I mean, literally palling around with Klansmen, like, and or former, convicted felons, and no one's saying anything. Is anybody like, who's this guy? What is he doing here?
Yes, this absolutely is a point of controversy because Buchanan, who has been dogged by some charges of anti-Semitism that are pretty well founded over the course of the 80s and 90s, he sees Metzger there and he's like, God damn it, like this guy. Like, here I am trying to make this seem like a normal mainstream policy, and now you have the founder of the Klan Border Watch who's at my event. He was not an invited guest. But what's interesting about it, Kelly, is that Buchanan, as he was thinking of running for president in 1992, one of the things he was looking to was the campaign of David Duke. David Duke, who had run, I think we've talked about this before on the show, in a special election in Louisiana and won as a Republican and former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And, Reagan had come out and denounced Duke. George H.W. Bush had denounced Duke. And Buchanan looked over at him and he's like, why are we denouncing Duke to win the favor of, like, Coretta Scott King? What we need to be doing is figuring out why Duke is winning. Not a huge mystery to figure out. And borrow from his issues and make them part of our issues. But he just didn't want it to be associated with somebody in a Klan hood. So that was the problem that Metzger represented, was it was reminding people, oh, right, this is a cross-burning thing. at a time when Buchanan did not want that reminder.
So are there efforts to, because I mean, I think politicians on both sides have, but generally I think with Republicans have had this thorny question of trying to pick up the mantle of some of these more unsavory positions, but also not have that direct association. We've done an episode about Reagan giving that speech at the Neshoba County Fair in 1980 and sort of doing the states' rights dog whistle, but then there were like straight up segregationists in the audience, and he's like, well, I don't like that, but I want to kind of, what were there concrete efforts on Buchanan's part to kind of like soften the edges around this kind of thing, but still maintain that allegiance?
Yes, I mean, he is trying to distance himself from Metzger and Duke in terms of pure associations. This comes up again in the 96 campaign, because Buchanan keeps running for president, where he has, like, people who had worked on the Duke campaign who are now working on his campaign, and he has to decide whether to let the person go or to keep them on. He's very close friends with Samuel Francis, who is going to come out in the late 1990s as just an overt white power, white nationalist guy. So he's constantly moving back and forth between distancing himself and being like, no, actually these ideas aren't as bad as you think they are, and trying to thread the needle on that. But I think that the Neshoba County Fair thing is really interesting because Buchanan, even as he's trying to draw distinctions between himself and the white Aryan resistance, is also putting down the dog whistle and picking up a bullhorn. Like, he doesn't go to Neshoba County, he goes to Stone Mountain, Georgia. It has all the Confederate generals on this rock face. Yeah, he talks about the Confederate soldiers in his family's history tree. He praises segregationists. It's a different tone than Reagan's.
Yeah. Are there ties between Buchanan's campaign and Trump's campaign? Like formal ties? There's parallels, but...
Right. There are not formal ties, in part because of the distance in time, and in part because, I don't think we've talked about this on the show, but in 2000, both Buchanan and Trump are vying for the Reform Party nomination against one another. That's the moment when Trump is like, Pat Buchanan is an anti-Semite and a Klansman. I don't want to be in a party with him.
What are you?
But, the Pat Buchanan runs under the America First banner in 1992. So a lot of the language and a lot of the policies are the same.
Yeah.
Wow. This is just fascinating to me. I also wonder, if it's not too much of a pivot, how much Pat Buchanan's religious views play into his popularity or play into like building up some of the ideology that he's trying to shape.
It's an interesting question. Pat Buchanan is Catholic, and so he didn't necessarily generate the same kind of buzz with the Christian Coalition as Pat Robertson when he ran in 1988 did, although he was speaking very much to religious right issues on abortion, on anti-feminism, and on those sorts of issues. He also has this history in the past of praising Catholic fascists like Franco in Spain. So I think that his politics more than his religion are at the forefront, but his religion very much informs his politics.
That helps. That makes sense. Yeah.
Buchanan, obviously a major figure in the book. Maybe even the cover is probably him. I don't know.
The cover is him. Yes.
Okay.
It is.
Yeah.
It's not a rendering. It's actually
an actual photo.
Oh, okay. There you go.
That's an actual photo of Pat Buchanan.
My copy hasn't arrived yet. Bookshop.com. Bookshop.org. I have some issues with you. It was supposed to arrive yesterday, but anyway. But obviously Buchanan, a huge figure in this book, in this era. The other thing you kind of mentioned, I think, last episode in framing the book was that coming out of the Cold War, there's this vacuum in terms of finding, an enemy. And that for so much of the Cold War, anti-communism was just such a clarifying and unifying conservative stance. Is it safe to say that the border is one of those things that just kind of steps in to fill that vacuum now that people are looking around for what is something we can point our ire towards?
Yeah, a new enemy.
The Cold War plays a huge role in two ways. First, in that way, because as you mentioned earlier, that these politics had to be constructed. it took time to convince voters that migrants from the South were vectors of criminality and disease, and they were stealing your jobs. That language only really starts to like take hold and become politically powerful in like 1993 and 1994. But it starts with like both Pat Buchanan and Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General at the time, in 92, are making claims that a third of the people arrested in the uprisings in Los Angeles in 1992 were in the country illegally. So they blame the unrest in Los Angeles on both Black people and on immigrants.
Wow.
Which is a big moment there. But the other thing, Jody, that I think the Cold War does is, you know, one reason that Reagan and Bush were so pro-NAFTA was because this idea of free trade and the free movement of peoples was really important to this Cold War conception of freedom in the United States, particularly on the right. And when the Cold War ends, the logic holding that position together starts to crumble. And so there's suddenly space for someone like Buchanan, who's a nativist, who wants a protectionist economic policy and a Fortress America approach to immigration, can suddenly have the space to do that.
Yeah. Wow. One last thing, and then we should wrap up, and people can go read the book. But do you get into, because you mentioned, you know, these groups that are gathered on the border? Do you get into the Minutemen? Is that in the 90s that stuff, these vigilante groups that start to pop up and so forth? These border watch groups.
Yeah, so the border watch groups had been around a little bit earlier than that. They were around in the 70s and 80s. Kathleen Belew writes about this in her terrific book, Bring the War Home, where she talks about how white power groups were attacking Vietnamese immigrants in the Gulf of Mexico around Texas, which had led to some really important domestic terrorism cases at the time. But yes, the growth of militias and their mainstreaming in the 1990s is a big part of the book.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Lots of other little hints as to what's in the book, and probably future episodes for us as well. But
lots to mine here.
Oh, yeah. Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt, author of Partisans. Thank you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And we will be back with one more episode after this in our Partisans Week. We'll see you then.
Radiotopia.